Okay, so far we've been talking at a fairly high level, and now I want to get into just a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of the stress response. And so when we're presented with a stressor or a stimulus that could potentially lead to stress, we see it, we experience it, and we take in that sensory information, and this is relayed to our thalamus, one of the central hubs of the brain for integrating information. And this is a really stressful stimulus, and this activates our stress reactions. We appraise that the demands are greater than our resources. Then this is going to communicate to our hypothalamus that we need to start the stress cascade. Right? We need to start mobilizing energy, and we need to start activating our sympathetic nervous system. And so all the processes we're going to see on this slide are all within the sympathetic nervous system. And so the hypothalamus is going to communicate with your pituitary gland. It's right near it in the brain, and it does so using CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. And so it's going to talk to the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary, or the front part of the pituitary. And that's going to release I can never say this right, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin for short. And then this is where we're going to sort of split the sympathetic nervous system into two different axes, and this is something that stress researchers are very interested in looking at, is the activation of these two different axes and the relative activation of each, and I'll explain more about why that's important in a moment. And so here we have, for the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, or the SAM axis, now we're heading over, and the anterior pituitary is now talking to your adrenal medulla, or part of your adrenal glands, and so it's communicating with this corticotropin hormone. And this is going to be what releases catecholamines, and this is the term for those stress hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine, or often called adrenaline and noradrenaline. So those are the same things, and so this is those stress reaction hormones. And this is the wing of the autonomic nervous system that really accounts for that fight or flight response. This is the fast reaction to stress. It mobilizes your heart to beat faster and harder with more force. It increases your blood pressure. You sweat more. You're going to breathe more. Your arteries are going to dilate, and your pupils are going to dilate as well. You're going to have an increase metabolic rate. You're going to use a lot of energy because you're going to, again, trying to mobilize all of this energy to cope with this stressor. And you're also going to see some immune system changes. We're going to cover this a lot more in the immune lecture. This is a complicated process, but we'll talk about that later. And you're going to see less digestive processes happening. Again, you don't need to store energy for later. And also you see a blunting of pain. And this is often why, and again, we'll talk about this in the pain lecture, but why when you're in a really stressful moment, you may not realize that you're injured until afterward. So this is the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, named for, we're in the sympathetic nervous system here, and there's this is the adrenal medulla, and so this is the side of the sympathetic nervous system that's operating through the adrenal medulla. Also important is that we can reappraise things, right? We said that we might appraise the situation as very stressful and that we don't have the resources we need to meet the demands, but maybe we realize that the demands are not so great, or that our resources are greater than we thought, and so this is happening in the frontal cortex or the neocortex, right, in the higher regions of our brain. We're making these more conscious assessments. And so this can feed back into how we appraise the stimulus itself, and then this can feed back to the thalamus, and so maybe now we see that this is not so stressful, and so the hypothalamus will stop releasing CRH, and so this fight or flight process would start to calm down. We also have the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, right? Again, named after all of these different pieces that we're going to see in it. And so here this is operating through the adrenal cortex, or a different part of your adrenal glands. And this is what releases glucocorticoids, and you heard a lot about these in the Sapolsky video. This is also cortisol is the main glucocorticoid. These are the stress hormones that operate with these long-term stressors. And so if we have not reappraised the situation as no longer being stressful, and it's the stressor lasts more than a few minutes, then we're going to start to activate more of these processes, and we're going to see a release of cortisol. And this takes some time. This is why if you're a researcher studying cortisol and you're having people spit in tubes so you can assess that, you have them spit in the tube 20 minutes after the stressful thing happened, because it takes time for these processes to occur. And so these glucocorticoids, if the stressor goes away after a few minutes, then you should have just a moderate amount of these glucocorticoids that are released after some amount of time, right? They start to be released about 20 minutes after you're stressed, and these communicate back with your hippocampus, and they should, if you have a healthy brain, they should tell your hippocampus that now it's time to shut down the stress cycle. These glucocorticoids have been released. They actually do really good things for the body in the short term, and one of their key roles is in regulating your stress response. And so the cortisol that's unreleased should feed back and tell your hippocampus that it's time to stop the stress reaction, tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing CRH, and stop both wings of the stress response, to shut down this SAM axis and shut down the HPA axis as well. But sometimes this doesn't happen. Maybe cortisol keeps on getting released, or the stressor doesn't go away, and so the hypothalamus continues to be active. And so this can occur, then we can start to see the long-term effects of stress. This is where we start to see a whole dysregulation of this axis, and we have people start to get hypertension, heart problems, issues with their immune system, which again we'll talk more about. People start to really store carbohydrates. This can lead to weight gain. We'll talk more about that as well. So this is really where those long-term negative effects of stress that are talked about in your video, and that we'll cover a lot more, come into play, is when we have a lot of cortisol released. And then also importantly here, right, I said cortisol should tell your hippocampus to shut down the stress response. But what happens is when people are stressed over and over again, or for long periods of time, your hippocampus, it's flooded with cortisol all the time, and it basically starts to say, yeah, I'm not going to respond to that. There's always cortisol, and so it becomes much less responsive to that, and so now the cortisol doesn't function in the same way to shut down the stress response, and this is what leads to what we call HPA dysregulation, where your whole response to stress and your cortisol system is really out of whack. And as we'll see in a future lecture, this is going to influence sleep and all kinds of other things, right? If our HPA is dysregulated, we're going to have our cortisol fluctuating in ways that are not going to be healthy for us, and that's going to cause long-term negative effects. So again, this is a lot in one slide, but this really is these two wings of the sympathetic nervous system, or branches of that, or axes, I guess we should say, because they're called the SAM axis and the HPA axis. And again, the difference really between the two is that the SAM axis is what's activated right away with a stress response, and the HPA axis is activated a bit later. It takes a bit more time, and it operates through a different pathway. And then this is also, the HPA is the one that's really implicated in what happens with long-term stress. When this axis stops working well, cortisol, which is usually a good thing to tell our stress system that, okay, it's been some time, it's time to shut down. When this gets out of whack, this is what leads to these long-term negative health effects. This slide is just here to state that in that big slide that we just showed, they had the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex on that, just to place these somewhere in the body. Maybe those terms are totally new to you, right? Most of these other things were up in the brain. But so, right, we had the pituitary gland that's in the brain, but the adrenal glands are sitting on our pancreas. And so they're here, and the adrenal medulla just means that's the middle part of the adrenal glands, and the adrenal cortex means that that's the outside of it, right? The cortex of the brain is the outside of the brain, and the adrenal cortex is the outside of the adrenal glands. And so again, the adrenal medulla, or the center of it, is responsible for releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, and the cortex is responsible for releasing glucocorticoids or cortisol. So there's other things besides cortisol that are implicated in stress. Those are just the main key players. But some other ones that are talked about a bit in the text, and that a few of these will, again, come up later in the course. And so you don't need to memorize these, but I just want to introduce them here if maybe you learned about them previously, or just to put them in your mind so that when we come to them later, you've heard them before. So there's glucagon, and this is released, and this is contributes to raising our circulating glucose levels, or our blood sugar, and this is part of mobilizing energy, and this hormone is going to come up again when we talk about eating and weight and the relation between stress and weight gain and weight loss. Also, prolactin, we won't talk as much about this, but this is secreted by the pituitary under stress, and this suppresses reproduction, right? If you're a highly stressed organism, it's not a good time to reproduce, so this prevents that from happening. Endorphins and enkephalines are also released when under stress, and this again will come up in the pain lecture. This plays the role of blunting pain. Vasopressin is another big one. This has a couple different roles. It's also sometimes called the antidiuretic hormone, but it constricts your blood vessels, and it also tells your kidneys to reabsorb water so that you can have that at your disposals to confront the stressor. We also see secretion of insulin, estrogen, and progesterone and testosterone are all inhibited under stress. And so these are just a lot of other really key hormones for regulating main body processes. And so the point I just want to make here is that when we're under stress, a lot of our key functions and key hormones for other processes in our body are altered, right? So our body really changes when we're under stress. Even if it's not something that's specific to the stress response, other processes are inhibited. Another important thing is this is a relatively recent addition to our understanding of stress, and we used to think always of fight and flight and sometimes freeze. But now there's another stress response that's talked a lot about in the literature, and this is the tendon-befriend response. This was proposed initially by Shelley Taylor and colleagues in 2000, although the roots of that stem back further. But this argues that the fight or flight conception of stress is really a male-centric perspective, that this is based on the evolutionary roles that males might have played in our species, that these would have been the two most adaptive responses for them, that they would have been encountering predators a lot in hunting, and that they could have two responses, fight or flee. But that for many women, particularly in early societies and in prehistoric times, right, that behavioral response might not be an option. Maybe you have your small children with you, you can't really leave your cave or nest or den, and to do that, or maybe you're not as big and strong to fight, particularly in other species this may be the case. And so this perspective argues that women may show different behavioral responses to stress, and instead of fight or flight, that the stress response might drive additional social affiliation and nurturant behavior, that in times of stress it would have been more adaptive to reach out to others for support and connect with others and to care for others in your community, including your young, that this would have been the more adaptive response for females. So there's tending and befriending. And importantly, so the underlying biological mechanism for this response is believed to be oxytocin. And so there are studies where we can squirt oxytocin up people's noses after they've been stressed, and then they are more likely to engage in affiliative responses, seek contact with others, nurture other people, engage in pro-social activities. And so the reason why this is focused more on women than on men is that oxytocin is a key hormone when breast feeding and bonding with young, and so it's often at higher levels in women. But this doesn't mean that the tendon-befriend response can't or doesn't happen in men. Men also have oxytocin, just like women have testosterone. Men also have oxytocin, and so we'll talk a bit more about the impact of pets on stress later, but one of the things that you can get from cuddling a dog is a boost of oxytocin, whether you're male or female, and this can help to reduce stress. And so this is some of the evidence for this tendon-befriend response, that not all stress is going to be reacted to with fight or flight. There's other potential adaptive responses, and this is the tendon befriend one. So that's all of that for new content here, and then if you haven't already, make sure you watch the video, Stress, A Portrait of a Killer. And so this is the documentary with Robert Sapolsky, who's also the author of your textbook, or the book that you're reading, and so there's interviews with him, and in this video he's really going to get into talking about why it is that stress could be both adaptive, like we've evolved to have these stress reactions, and yet in our modern society this can have still long-term negative effects when we're stressed, and so even when our body is doing what it's supposed to be doing, this can lead to long-term negative health outcomes, and so that's the topic of the video. So just a little lightener for the end. So stressed is just desserts spelled backwards, so this is just a reappraisal of stress, so it's just desserts. All right, so that's it for today, and thank you very much.